Dr. Wolf is a clinical psychologist and also a neuropsychologist. Today, he is going to present to you evidence-based how PTSD affects the brain and how you can rewire it. Okay? PTSD is not a lifetime bad thing. You can treat yourself, and there are treatments for it. I also have Lieutenant Maureen Themis-Fernandez here.
I am so honored to be here.
Known lovingly in the community as Lieutenant Mo. Lieutenant Mo is passionate about raising awareness on mental health issues for our law enforcement, first responders, and our military community. As I said, we're all here today because it is National PTSD Awareness Month. And I am going to turn the mic over to Lieutenant Mo.
I just wanted to bring up some vital information about post-traumatic stress disorder and just some general information that will help our community. It's normal after being exposed to a disturbing incident or a life-threatening incident to experience some kind of stress. It's normal to have upsetting memories or nightmares or gain or lose your appetite or have trouble sleeping. And we need to understand that's stress following trauma. It's when these symptoms are lasting on a prolonged basis that something else is going on here. And that's where the disorder comes from. There's so many names to it. You know, for law enforcement, they call it career cumulative trauma stress in some areas. In the fire department, they can call it post-traumatic stress injury. But it's really just different shades of the same picture. And so I think that's really important if you're new to the world of PTSD or post-traumatic stress to understand that. And it's really when the symptoms last for a period of time and you just can't seem to go about your daily function that something else is going on. And just to go back to some of the symptoms, you know, if you're reliving the event, if you're having flashbacks or nightmares, avoidance of the event. You know, I have some officers that have been involved in, particularly one that I'm thinking of, is involved in a major crash with a traumatic brain injury, and that officer does not want to go back to the scene of the incident. Okay, they want to avoid that area at all cost. Some of the and other individuals that I've been in law enforcement for 21 years, so and I'm third generation law enforcement. So as a wife, as an officer, you know, I have a lot of exposure to this in different areas. The negative feelings, some officers or some first responders are in a bad mood. They don't know why, or they feel on edge. That's very common. You know, easily startled. Okay, so those are some of the symptoms if you're new to the world of PTSD for you to be aware of. You know, apathy, not caring. You know, why bother writing this report? Why bother going to this call? It's not going to make a difference. You know, you have to understand that perhaps something else is going on rather than just a discipline issue, that there might be something deeper. And I'm hoping that as I travel all over the state and raise awareness, that people can start to make these distinctions with our personnel who are exposed to so much on so many different levels. You know, unhealthy habits, smoking, alcohol, you know, using prescription drugs, reckless acts. That's all part of something else is going on, and it's something else to look for. You know, I spend a lot of time educating supervisors and town administrators and different individuals so that they are aware of it. Awareness is such a key factor with PTSD. Just to give you a little picture of what we're dealing with, just in the general population, think about this for a minute. Just over 60% of our general population will be exposed to a single traumatic event in their life. And of that 60%, 20% will go on to develop PTSD. So I ask our first responders when I'm teaching all over, and I ask their law enforcement, our military, how many were you exposed to yesterday, last week, last month, last year, over 20 years? And isn't it no wonder that almost 25% of law enforcement officers will suffer from PTSD at some point in their lives? You know, and it's also a significant factor. There's in the 125 to 150 suicides that are reported annually. And I want to make a distinction here.
Okay.
It's reported annually but the number is really 300 to 400, closer to 300 or 400.
Wow.
Why is there a discrepancy? Okay, that comes from, trying to protect the families. That's part of it. And trying to ensure that some type of benefits or something would be allowed for the families. And also the stigma. There is a stigma still associated with it. But, and so a lot of these suicides are reported as accidental discharge or cause of death undetermined. So it's a huge number, and even in the fire department, and more firefighters will die by suicide than are killed in the line of duty.
The suicide rate in our fire department nationally is up 500%.
Yeah, it's all over, and we definitely need to take a stand against PTSD. We have to stand together, and we have to do something about it. And don't forget, and I know you are familiar with this, the percentage with military veterans, that has not gone down. Over 300,000 veterans are suffering from PTSD. That's 22 suicides daily, and it hasn't gotten down. So the way we go about this is getting the information out there and educating people what to look for, what they can do, and reducing the stigma associated with mental health support. Heroes get help, and we need to reinforce that all over in as many venues as we can. And look out for each other.
Yes.
Like your buddy up system.
Yes.
Look out for each other, take care of each other. A lot of the officers will ask me, how can I start the dialogue with another employee or another officer? And I say the simple 3 words, quote, I noticed that. What does I notice that tell you? That I care about you, that you matter, that there's something different about you going on, and I'm going to be a friend to you and try and help you through it. And then I also tell the individuals that I teach all over is, offer something concrete, because the 2 biggest things in military and law enforcement and first responders is perfectionism and self-reliance. And that self-reliance, we're the ones that people call for help. We're not supposed to need help. And that's not true. Like I said, heroes get help. So if you want to be a buddy to somebody and you notice that they're struggling, first you tell them, I noticed that. And the second part of it is, this is what I'm going to do. Don't say, is there anything I can do? Because that self-reliance is going to come in and, oh no, you know that. Is there anything I can do? No, I'm good. No, you offer them something concrete. Hey, let's go get dinner. Let's go to a buddy up session. Let's go to the gym together. How about I watch your kids? Even go with you to get mental health help. That's being a true buddy to each other and looking out for each other.
I just wanted to interject. Another thing that I hear is they'll say, are you okay? You know what? Call me. They're not going to call you. If somebody, is getting depressed or getting sad or getting disconnected, they are not going to call. So we need our friends and buddies to reach in and make that face-to-face contact.
That's so important. I'm glad you brought that up. Be a pain in the butt to somebody.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's what they need.
Yes, and in the military, we use the acronym ACE. Ask your buddy, care for your buddy, and escort your buddy. ACE is a nice way to remember that you need to reach out and help them and not just take no for an answer, but kind of hang with them if they're in trouble.
That's awesome. I know it as ACT. The A and the C and then T, take them. So very good.
I like that. ACE is ACT.
ACE and ACT are pretty much the same.
And
ACE.
Say it again.
Ask your buddy, care for your buddy, escort your buddy.
Escort. Okay, and yours is ask, care, take.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so remember that those acronyms, either ACE or ACT, whatever resonates with you.
We're on the same page. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up is that, women tend to suffer more from PTSD. So I believe it's almost double. You can correct me, doctor, but I believe it's almost double. But it doesn't matter whether it's half, whether it's double. Suffering is suffering. So it's a gender difference. And men are going to be more outwardly angry, and women are going to internalize it in general. It could be a little bit different. In my own family, both my father and other members of my family suffered from PTSD, and I didn't recognize it growing up. Some of the symptoms that you saw, I just thought my dad had in some cases, a bad temper. I didn't realize he was acting out from the military, from his military experiences and from his law enforcement background. But having understand it more, I can see that. And I see some of the females that I work with in law enforcement tend to be more on edge, more emotional. But again, suffering is suffering. So just something to keep in mind.
Is that it, Lieutenant Mo?
I could go on and on. Like I said, it's so important that we either act or we be an ace to somebody. And the peer support is vital. I'm working very closely here in Davie with Nova Southeastern University. And what we're doing in Nova is we're doing phase 2. First, we're raising awareness. The second part of it, building family and spouse support programs. So to educate our families and our spouses so they understand and the symptoms of PTSD and can get help at an earlier stage of the process. And the other thing is transition to retirement, because we're finding that the first 5 years after retirement, I know this myself to be true, remember, third generation law enforcement, the first 5 years after retirement is such a big time of upheaval, changing of identity in some cases. So we need to do maybe a year before the retirement, prepare ourselves mentally as well as financially for retirement. And the third prong of what I call the trifecta that we're developing with Nova, and I hope other agencies throughout the country follow our lead, is the peer, and people know about the peer counseling or peer support programs. So we can educate, because quite often, you know, peers are the first ones there when something bad happens. If they can get in and start offering support in the best way possible early on, they can save years of suffering and years of counseling. And it's just such an important aspect of it. So that's the upcoming trifecta. So we're going to be launching that in the fall.
Awesome. I just wanted to mention or interject about our firemen. The highest rate of their suicide is after they retire. So they're connected with this brotherhood and this family, and then they retire and they have no one. So I just want to put it out there that, you know, when your buddy retires, you got to continue to make that connection. You know, we got to continue that brotherhood even when they're retired. That's when they need you most.
And I love what you do with the Live to Tell Buddy Up program. More and more people are taking advantage of that, and it's such a great way to build that bridge.
What it is, it's not really, well, I guess it is a program, but it's a social.
Right.
So we are just building community of military, first responders, and law enforcement. We get together for an evening of food, fun, and camaraderie, and it's just an awesome evening. We are into our 4th year. We have over 500 members, and we average anywhere from, well, average, I'm giving you a span, anywhere from 40 to 70 in attendance each month. And it's in Davie at the Davie Women's Club. In fact, tomorrow night is the next Let's Buddy Up. It's at 7 p.m. And if you're local, you can just go to my website, letslivetoTell.org, or on Facebook, Let's Buddy Up Davie. You'll be able to find our information. I also just wanted to state that after Dr. Wolf is finished speaking, we are going to take callers. So save your calls. You know, when he's finished speaking, we're going to open up the phone line. I only have one phone line, and I will give you the number when we are ready to take calls, and we would love to hear from you. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Wolf now.
Great, thank you very much. What you're looking at on the screen right now is a scan of a healthy brain and a brain with post-traumatic stress disorder. And this scan measures the inflammatory response in the brain to cortisol. So the brain on the right, you can see the cortisol, the fight or flight hormone that's been produced and that's in the brain of the person who's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the problem with this, in the early stages, that's a good thing. Over time, however, it can impair mental performance, it can make you have a greater sensitivity to pain, and it can also cause you to have a dysregulation of emotions. So the brain of a person with PTSD has cortisol. It's a panic reaction. And the brain can then easily be tricked into an alarm state. Okay. At this next slide here, I'm just going to give you a couple of quick objectives. We're going to talk about the three big differences between a brain with PTSD and one without PTSD, and we're also going to be talking about the kinds of things that you can do to help a traumatized brain to recover. Now, it's important for me to say, I'm required to say that I don't have any relevant financial relationships related to this talk. It's also important to say that the comments that I'm making really represent my opinions, my evidence-based opinions based upon research and my work as a clinician, and they do not represent the Department of Defense or the Department of Army. I'm a civilian psychologist and neuropsychologist with the Army. We're going to go to the next. The threat perception system, there are three big differences in the brain of a person with PTSD versus a brain with a person that doesn't have PTSD, are the threat system. The threat system is the amygdala, which you can see here in this part of the brain right here. I'm sorry, here we go. Right in this area here, that is the amygdala. It's an almond-shaped part of the brain, and that part of the brain is involved with both anxiety and anger. Then we see the filtering system, which is a little higher up in the brain in the front here, and in the prefrontal cortex, where it says prefrontal cortex, the thinking feeling part of the brain, and that's the part of the brain where you distinguish between what is relevant now and what you can dismiss, and that kind of gets messed up. Let me give you an example. Somebody who was in combat, for example, and maybe they were in Afghanistan, and they're smelling the smells in the field where there's cattle, and they begin then to have a flashback of being in Afghanistan and something that may have happened at that time. That part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, would say, no, this is now, that was then. That was 5 years ago. I'm here now. That's not now. But when that goes offline, because the amygdala and the thalamus, which is between A and B on the screen, is overreacting, then the front part of the brain goes down. Now, how do we know it goes offline? We know it goes offline because when we put a person into a scanner and we review a script with them of something that traumatic that has happened to them, we can see that that part of the brain is dark, and the middle part of the brain, the limbic system, the amygdala, and the thalamus is very, very hot and reactive. And so that's how we know. All right. So what about the emotional brain? Okay. That's in the brainstem and the limbic system. So you're walking down a path, and suddenly you think you see a snake, you jump back, and you experience either the fight or flight mechanism, or maybe you freeze. And when that happens, the amygdala and the limbic system has reacted. It reacts in milliseconds. However, you realize it's a coiled rope. And that's the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain in the front of the brain that tells you that that is not what I'm seeing. But because we're here on this planet and we've survived, because we have this wonderful limbic system, we react first, and then we can think in terms of what's really going on here. Now, that's of course if the amygdala and the limbic system isn't overpowering the prefrontal cortex, which is what happens with PTSD. So what about a flashback? A flashback is really a fusion of the past with the present. Now, flashbacks are important. They've always been important, but they're not really the most important part of PTSD. But in 1975, when they started to work on DSM-3, which was the third version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where we have all these diagnostic categories, we didn't have PTSD. PTSD did not exist. And in order for what the clinicians who work with PTSD were trying to do is to get the Veterans Administration to really recognize that this disorder existed. So they had to tie the reaction that people were having, a flashback, to a particular memory or something that had happened to them. And that's really how the PTSD diagnosis really came into being. Before that, it was called traumatic neurosis, and it was within the person as opposed to being tied to something outside the person. Now, the problem with a flashback is that the timekeeping part of the brain, the part of the brain that is called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is on the side of the front and the side of your brain, on the left side, that goes offline. And when that goes offline, you can't determine what's happening now versus what happened in the past. So it's really important for us to get that back online, and we'll talk in a minute about how you do that. Broca's area is in the left front part of the brain, in what's called the left temporal lobe, where your speech is. And if you've ever seen anybody who's really, really stressed, they can't talk. It's like deer in the headlights. You know, they're just kind of dumbfounded there for a moment. And sometimes in therapy, when you're working with someone and they're discussing their trauma, they kind of space out. And that's because Broca's area is affected. So therapy needs to bring this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the Broca's area back online. So we're going to talk about how that happens. Now, an easy way to remember about these three areas is we have the smoke detector, which is the amygdala, deep within the brain. That's where the norepinephrine and the epinephrine, and then, you know, it's stimulated, the cortisol from the adrenal glands is produced in that first slide that you saw. Then we have the cook, which is the thalamus. That's a part that kind of integrates your sensory experiences. You know, your sights, your sounds, your smells, they all get integrated. But in PTSD, they're disintegrated. And the person actually can become numb. And we can talk about that in a minute or two. And then we have the watchtower, which is that medial prefrontal cortex, that center part in the front of your brain, that or your self-experiencing part of your brain, that kind of determines and helps you to make decisions. If we look at this next slide here, down in the very bottom there, you can see the amygdala. The amygdala is right next to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is where you process your memories. Isn't it kind of interesting that the part of the brain that gets activated with PTSD, that gets activated with a fight or flight response, is right next to the hippocampus where your memories are processed? And the amygdala gets overstimulated. After trauma, the amygdala can get caught up in a highly alert and activated loop during which it perceives threat everywhere. And that's one of the reasons people begin to medicate themselves with alcohol, with drugs. They sometimes withdraw. They don't want to go anywhere because their amygdala is overstimulated. Then we see the hippocampus, which is next to the amygdala, and that is where, you know, as you said before, you process your memories. And so the interruption keeps both the body and the mind kind of stimulated in a kind of reactive mode, and neither element receives the messages that the threat has transformed. The threat is now in the past. It's not happening now. It happened, you know, before. And then we go to the cook, and then now we're at the watchtower. And the watchtower is you can see here in that purple part in the front on the brain on the right brain that's being displayed. That is where your prefrontal cortex is. That's where your decisions are made. That's where you decide that, you know, this is now, and that happened to me before. And as you can see, the amygdala there as well. Let's go to the next one. Now, this is an interesting case. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but what you're looking at is the worst traffic accident that ever happened in Canada. And Stan and Uda were coming from Ontario, and they were traveling to Detroit. They were going to go to a conference. It was an early morning, and suddenly there was a fog on the highway. And Stan got into the fog, and he began to brake. And Stan and Uda's car was the 13th car of 84 cars and trucks that were involved in this collision. 8 people died, 34 people were seriously injured, and it still is the worst motor vehicle collision ever in Canada. Now, what's interesting about this is that Stan and Uda, they thought they were okay. A trucker crashed the window, the front window, and Stan was able to get out, and they both had to drag Uda out because she froze. So there we have an example of the fight or flight response with Stan and the freeze response with Uda. They were okay, they thought. Physically, they didn't have any major injuries, a couple scratches, that kind of thing. They were very fortunate. However, they both developed PTSD, and they both looked very similar in their PTSD response. But when we put them into a scanner and we looked at their brains were very, very different. Stan, who was experiencing the fight or flight response when someone read a narrative of what had happened to him, his amygdala and the thalamus became very hot and reactive, and the prefrontal cortex and that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex I showed you a few minutes ago was dark. He was having he was having difficulty discriminating between then and now. Uda, on the other hand, her brain was dark. The amygdala wasn't lit up, the thalamus wasn't lit up, the prefrontal cortex wasn't lit up. And when she got out of the scanner, they said, "What did you feel?" as they read the narrative. And she said, "Nothing." And that's an example of numbness. That was also a symptom. So a big job of being a therapist for traumatized people is to be able to be an affect regulator. Somebody who keeps the body safe and makes it safe for the mind to visit the past without being hijacked by that amygdala. The brain of someone seeking help is shut down in response to remembering trauma in some cases. And that means that the job of the therapist is to help the brain to become activated. So we just had the slide on there about the neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is really important because if you've been in theater as a combat soldier and you've gone out the wire and you've been exposed to life-threatening events every day, you become hypervigilant, you become hyper-alert, and that behavior and that emotional system is appropriate. You better be hypervigilant, you better be alert, because people want to hurt you. But when you come home and your wife wants you to go to a restaurant with her, and you, if you go, have to sit against the wall, the neurons in the brain have been connected to a situation where they're strangers, where you're in an open space, even with a crowd. And so neurons that fire together wire together. So you react in the way that you would have been in combat. However, what has to happen is that with exposure and with learning calming techniques that we're going to talk about in a minute or two, yoga and biofeedback and meditation, mindfulness meditation, the research is really, really gearing up and showing us that that's what can quiet down that limbic system so that you're actually able to process what has happened and make that distinction between that was then and this is now. This is a very important slide here where we're showing you the polyvagal system, the 10th cranial nerve. Now, as a historical note, in 1872, Charles Darwin actually was the first person to discover this nerve pathway. Very interesting. He didn't know what it meant, but there was a nerve that connected the brain with the different organ systems. And what's called the ventral part, the front part there, is connected to the heart, and you can see the heart and the lungs. And that's called and only mammals have that. We have that. The reptilian part of the 10th cranial nerve that reptiles also have and only have that part connects these other organ systems like your stomach and your intestines and so forth. And so why is this important? Well, it's important because if we can calm the body, we can communicate to the mind that it's okay. So, in fact, we've learned that 80% of the fibers are afferent, which means they go from the body into the brain, and only 20% from the brain down to the body. So if you can calm your body through mindfulness meditation, through yoga, through biofeedback assisted relaxation methods and so forth, you can actually communicate to the brain that it's okay. And now your prefrontal cortex and your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can say, okay, this is now, the danger isn't now, the danger was then. And you can begin to make those distinctions. As we look at the next slide here, I like to show this slide because when I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, I stood up the traumatic brain injury clinic there. I examined thousands of, and believe it, it were thousands of service members coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who had been blown up. And you service members out there, you know what I'm talking about. But there's this distinction that they wanted to make between TBI and PTSD, and it was confusing because, as you can see here, look at the large circle. You see there that those particular symptoms overlap TBI and PTSD. They're similar, and you can see memory problems. So I would get referred somebody with a memory problem who was blown up in Mosul or someplace, and they had been in a striker or some other kind of vehicle, was a rollover, and they had had a concussion, and they were complaining of memory problems and attention problems. So is it PTSD? Is it TBI? After a while, we said, hey, it doesn't really matter. We just want to treat the person and give them the help that they need.
Amen to that.
This is an interesting slide here. This was a study done a long time ago, back in 1989, by Basil van der Kolk, who's famous. He's at Boston University Medical Center. He has a trauma center there. He's written a number of books. But what he did was he took, at that time there were Vietnam veterans who had been in combat, and Vietnam veterans who had been in combat and had PTSD. They've been diagnosed with PTSD, and he showed them this slide. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, that's slide number 2, plate 2 of the Rorschach. And of course, today we use a lot of personality tests like the MMPI and the PAI and so forth, and I use them also, and I find them to be extremely helpful. But what's interesting about a projective test like this is that you're getting the person's perception. You're showing them this kind of stimulus, and you're asking them, what do you see? And what the service members, veterans with PTSD saw were, guess what? This guy's leg was blown off. Oh, there was someone who was shot. You see the blood? And the service members who did not have PTSD said, oh, those are 2 dancing bears. What do you see? What was very interesting was that about 25% didn't see anything. They said, there's nothing there. That's just ink. And of course, it is ink. But what's very sad about that was that those people with PTSD lost their imagination. And when you lose your imagination, it becomes very difficult to think about yourself having a future. And so that's another reason we want to get you back online. Contextual processing, what does that mean? There's a context to this stuff. If you're seeing a bear in a zoo, you're going to have a different experience than seeing a bear if you're walking down a trail in the wild. Context matters. And there's a disrupted connection between the hippocampus, that memory part of the brain, where memories are processed, and the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And so getting those back online, we have this abnormal fear, we have an exaggerated threat response in the thalamus, the executive function, that prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain in the front of your brain that integrates things, puts things into a context, and that's really important. Survivors are unique. Their healing will be individual. There is no one-size-fits-all or personal guarantee for what will work, and the same program will not work for everyone. You know, in these evidence-based programs, cognitive processing, psychotherapy, prolonged exposure therapy, these are evidence-based treatments. And what works for one person may not work for the other person. What's really important in the very beginning is to establish a relationship with that person, so that person that you're working with has trust. It's so critical. Eye movement desensitization, some of you have heard of that also. EMDR is another kind of treatment. So the majority of the evidence suggests that when survivors commit to a process of exploring and testing treatment options, they can, over a period of time, reduce the effects of trauma and even eliminate symptoms of PTSD. But here's the thing to remember. Once a warrior, always a warrior. You'll never forget, but you may just have a different experience. These next things here are called adjunctive treatments. I don't really think they're adjunctive treatments, because remember, what you have to first do is calm down the brain. And that's what these things do: biofeedback, neurofeedback, transcendental meditation, brain entrainment, yoga, Tai Chi. Very important. And in my clinic, where I start, in addition to developing a rapport and a relationship with a person, is I help them with what's called heart rate variability biofeedback. And so mindfulness, meditation, biofeedback, and so forth. So here's a slide of heart rate variability biofeedback. I think we're going to show you a little video. And the slide in the top there, it says happy. That is the heart rate variability, not the heart, not the pulse. It's the beat-to-beat change in the pulse over time. And the top one is a person who's learned how to be calm. And the bottom one is a person who is under a lot of stress. So we're going to show you a little video of how this works.
So this is great. I watched this video earlier. It's about 6 minutes, and it's very informative. I encourage you all to continue watching this video. It's a lot of good information. And we are just getting that video up. That's a lot of good information, Dr. Wolf.
Good.
A lot of good information.
Great. We want to help.
Yes. And I love what you said, once a warrior, always a warrior.
Yes.
Here we go.
For 40 years, I lived in a world that was a result of Vietnam, but I was out of touch with it. My wife wakes up one morning in a headlock. My words to her are, "I'm going to dispatch you."
I was what they call a saw gunner, squad automatic weapon. So I was part of a small unit fire team, and we were doing sweeps through the city of Fallujah.
It's not a function of intelligence, but it's a function of emotional trauma that's unresolved that bubbles up just like a volcano, and that's exactly what happened. So I popped.
So basically I lost both my knees, but my doctors were able to save my legs through various surgical techniques.
My husband came home and said, "I am dying. I only have 18 months to 2 years to live." I said, "No, you're not gonna die on my watch. We're gonna have to figure out what ways we have to explore options."
Although I'm not a techie, this little piece of equipment turned my life around. When I felt something different happen inside of me, when I felt coherence happen, when I felt balance, when the anxiety of the PTSD, syndrome, whatever you want to call it, was no longer present, I had a new reference point.
We now see that you're in green, so that means you're in high coherence.
Actually, for the first time in my life, I have known what it means to feel joyful. I've never felt joyful before.
We have to understand the purpose of our lives, and hard math gives you the start point to understand yourself first.
The brain and the heart actually sends more information upstairs to the brain in our head than the other way around.
The training portion, the second T, if you will, the technology, practice, use, apply, and experience something different, worked, okay? The second part of it is you got to use that stuff. You got to apply it on a daily basis.
I was given the opportunity to fly in a L-39 jet. These guys gave me the ride of my life, and I was like, man, what do I got to do to fly one of these things? In June of 2010, I got my sport pilot license. My flight instructor let me go solo. So I go up and just fly the pattern, and I come back around, lower the flaps, and going down toward the runway, and it just doesn't feel right, and so I go around. And I go down for the second time, it just doesn't feel right again, so I go around again. And, I noticed that after the second go around, my breathing had gotten a little bit quicker. I was really anxious. And I started doing the heart-focused breathing and telling myself that I could do this. And so I put the plane on the ground and I walked away.
If they expect a silver bullet, if they think sitting down with an M-wave is going to change their PTSD, they don't understand what their situation is. They don't understand what they've created. It's time to assume full responsibility for yourself. That's not what most vets do. They indulge in pity parties. They indulge in blame. They feel as though they're victims. And I'm not saying that that's not accurate, but so what? What are you going to do with that? Are you going to wallow in it? Or are you going to pick it up and say, if I want my life to change, I'm going to have to change myself. And that's what I saw HeartMath doing. Is HeartMath was giving me a venue that allowed me to change my life.
The breath of life, the connection of the heart, and that relationship with the brain is what allowed me to move from one morphic field, like in physics, they talk about that morphic field where I was just getting crap, to shift into a new field of energy where things all of a sudden were happening, and HeartMath was the beginning.
So that's HeartMath, that's heart rate variability biofeedback, and it helps to calm the brain. And it's something I use with people that I work with almost every day. And I ask them to do three things to kind of conclude. Focus in on the center of their chest where their heart is. Take a deep breath, not holding your breath, but take a deep breath, but let the belly come out. And then, almost as if you're breathing through your belly button or your navel, and then exhale a little bit more slowly. It's kind of like breathing in and then out, and so forth. And then have a positive feeling thought. I have a yellow lab, and when I come home from work and get home, my lab Bambi's at the door greeting me, and her tail's going back and forth, and that's a good feeling for me, and I'm sure that's a good feeling for Bambi. Or, when I was on a vacation, I think about that, and being on a cruise ship island or something like that, or whatever is positive for you. I have a dental hygienist patient, a former service member who, thinks about a river and a forest, and walking in that forest, heart focus, heart breathing, positive feeling, thought. And if you do that, even though you can't see it, you will produce that top grid that we saw with the happy heart rate variability. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. That was an awesome presentation, a lot of good information, and a lot of hope for a lot of people. As I was said earlier, people think that a PTSD diagnosis is a terrible, terrible thing, and it's not. You know, you have post-traumatic stress because you're a survivor. And so let's hone in on those skills and do what you need to do to get yourself help and to learn how to live again. And I love that you had mentioned yoga is one of the things that turns that piece of the brain back on. What piece of the brain is that?
That it calms down the amygdala and the thalamus, integrates it, and then turns on the prefrontal cortex and that part of the brain that says, this is now, and that was then, whether it was 10 years ago or whether it was a year ago or 6 months ago.
That's awesome. That's some good information. And I loved you said, okay, yoga, mindfulness, which I am practicing mindfulness myself.
Awesome.
I know, I don't know if my audience knows, if everybody knows, but I lost both of my children and I am going through the grief journey, and I have really bad days and I have really good days, but I'm practicing mindfulness to get me through those days. And mindfulness works with all kinds of life stuff.
I'm so glad you both brought that up. I've been teaching mindfulness to law enforcement probably the last year and a half. And I teach the same breathing that you're talking about with the heart. It's the same breathing I teach them, and think they can do this in between calls. I myself have done some of these mindfulness tactics immediately after a critical incident to let me know, hey, the threat is over. I remember one of my officers almost got killed, and for a few minutes we thought he had. And after that whole scene was done, and 6.5 hours later, I'm like, I need to practice mindfulness. And I did it right in the front seat of my car and brought myself back to the present because I need to minimize what has just transpired. So I applaud you and both of you for recognizing how valuable mindfulness is. I know the military's started to use it and train soldiers before they deploy.
Yes.
And the incidence of PTSD is significantly reduced upon the return from combat. So we're on to something here.
Absolutely.
Yes, we are.
And you serve as a great role model for other officers.
Oh, well, thank you.
Our Lieutenant Mo from the Davie PD. We love her. We want to open up the phone line to callers. Again, the number is 954-789-7639. I also have it posted on YouTube on the chat. So if you would like to call and speak to Lieutenant Mo or Dr. Wolf or myself, give us a call and you can be live on MoAB's Bunker. I loved what you said, Dr. Wolf, about, PTSD, that it is a natural response. Or did Lieutenant Mo say that? I don't remember now. I got so much good information from the both of you. And I always say there's no shame in PTSD. The only shame is the silence of it. So we just got to keep spreading the word.
Dialogue is key, and that's we got to open the conversations. And I encourage people who are in treatment to tell your buddies that you are in treatment, so they realize that that's a normal part of the healing process. And it just only if we keep the dialogue open can we make the changes that need to be made.
Be the example. Take the first step.
That's right.
Be the example.
I don't want to forget our children, because in our society, believe it or not, and this is a startling statistic for me, for every service member that has developed PTSD, there are 10 children who have been traumatized. And these kinds of things, childhood sexual abuse and sexual assault, is something that's very much more prevalent in our society than people realize. And these children grow up and then become reactive as adults. And that's what we call complex trauma. Very difficult to work with, but these people can get better too. But childhood trauma is very serious, and we see a lot of it in our society. And I'm sure that Lieutenant Mo has been exposed to that as well in her work.
It's so important for us as first responders and law enforcement and that when we come across, and we just had it the other night, it was a very bad crash on Orange Drive, and the fire department and police, remembered there were kids involved in that crash that witnessed something terrible. And the teddy bears came out, and the water came out, and there were hugs for these kids. We're starting emotional first aid right on the scene. And I just think that that's a good change, a good trend. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but being so conscious of that, to prevent future victims.
So important.
Community is so important, and how awesome that a police officer right here in the town of Davie taking the lead, Dr. Chris Wolf, getting together. This is what community is about.
We're in this together. We're standing up together, and we're in it to win it.
In it to win it. That's right.
Failure is not an option.
Well, I guess we're not going to have any callers. I guess everybody has so much information, they're just going to think about it. But I want to remind everybody, or let everybody know, that Friday at noon, we're going to be broadcasting live again. I'm going to have the founder of Connected Warriors here, and they do free yoga for our military, and I'm not sure if it's first responders also. Do you know, Mo?
I thought they did. I'm almost 100% sure.
Okay, so they do free yoga for our military and first responders, and I'm going to have the founder right here in MoAB's bunker at 12 o'clock. I'd like to ask you to remind you all to please subscribe to my channel so you will get notified when we do go live. And thank you all for tuning in. And Dr. Wolf, thank you so much. And I am so thankful that I have all that on tape and I can go back and watch this again and again.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And Lieutenant Mo, you're awesome.
I'm grateful to be here.
The most awesome cop in Davie.
Oh, stop. I don't know about that, but I'm so grateful to be here. And I'm also great that you and I made the connection, and Dr. Wolf as well. Together we're just amazing.
Let's do this, guys. I like to end the show with one positive, little thing that helps you through your day. One little positive goodie or nugget to leave with the audience.
Well, here's something I'd like to recommend to people, and it's a gratitude exercise, and it's part of being mindful that Lieutenant Mo talked about. What I try to do every night when I get into bed is I think about one positive thing that happened during the course of the day, one little thing. And as a consequence of that, I'm alert to looking for it all day long. And I'm not talking about because I have a roof over my head or I have enough to eat. I'm talking about someone who, held a door for me when I was carrying a package and I couldn't grab the door, or something very simple like that. But if you do that, if you have a gratitude exercise at night, right when you get into bed, when you think about it and you think about something positive that happened, you not only take that positive thought into your sleep with you, which is a great thing because we know nightmares are problematic for people with PTSD, or all of us sometimes we have those bad dreams, but also it makes you become more aware during the course of your day to be looking for something positive. So that would be a recommendation I would have.
That's a great recommendation. I like that.
I'm not ashamed to admit it, but I pray on the way in. I have an hour-long commute, and it sets my intention for the day. I pray for safety for my officers and the department and the community. And it's saying something positive. We're going to have a good day. We're going to stay safe, and we're going to get through this together.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you, Lieutenant Mo. I practice thankfulness. Sometimes when I'm sad, or when I don't know what to do, I just become thankful for this. For my shower, for my house, for my bed. I just am very thankful for things, and press on regardless.
Amen to that.
And that's all I have to say. So signing out from MoAB's bunker, you all have a good evening and walk safe.